skip over that. We have a hearing continuation on the Office of Veterans Affairs. If you'll take out your budget from last Thursday when we met, and I would entertain any motions for recommendations and or passing the budget out. Representative Rees.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that we approve the budget for the Kansas Commission on Veterans Affairs Office for FY 24 through 25.
Moved by Representative Ruiz, seconded by Representative Ballard. Is there a discussion on that motion? Seeing none. All in favor of the Ruiz motion, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Okay, we'll consider the Kansas Commission on Veterans Affairs budget passed. Thank you, committee. Next, we'll move on to the hearing on the budget for Kansas Department of Children and Families. And to begin that, we'll hear from our legislative research analyst, Amanda Prosser. Welcome to committee.
Hello. Yes, I am Amanda Prosser with Legislative Research. We'll be covering DCF's budget today. So thankful to have behind me, we have Secretary Laura Howard, Deputy Secretary Dan Lewin, Deputy Secretary Tanya Keys, and Budget Director Tammy Tompkins, all wonderful experts who will be happy to answer any questions that you have following this. As all of you are aware, this is the KLRD budget analysis document. It is massive. I am going to flip through and kind of hit certain sections rather than going through the whole thing. I think it's meant more as a reference document. We're going to start, first few pages provide the executive summary. Page 5 is kind of important. This page provides a nice list summarizing the SGF appropriations that were made last year. So hopefully, as you read through the list, most of it should seem familiar and ring a bell. Next, we're going to jump to page 6, where we'll dive into the details of the current fiscal year. So we're going to start page 6 for 24. On the top of the table, you can see that the legislative approved amount is $870.6 million all funds with $432.7 million SGF. The SGF amount includes just under $27 million in reappropriations. These SGF reappropriations occur for a variety of reasons, including delayed IT projects, misalignment between state and federal fiscal years for grants and contracts, as well as the agency's own efforts to save money in various expenditure categories. And so on this table, if you would like, I encourage you to take a pen and mark next to item 1, write page 17. Because after you've done that, if you flip to page 17, you'll see a special topics section of the BA that's going to list out the agency's plans for using those reappropriated dollars. So that's the funds that weren't spent in 23 but are going to be spent in 24. That whole list is on page 17. But we're going to stay again, page 6, sticking with the current year. The middle of the table, you can see item 2 is showing the agency's revised estimate includes 1.1 million SGF to account for the shortfall in appropriations for the legislative pay plan from last session. This is the only additional SGF the agency has as a request for 24. Moving down the table, items 3 through 8, that is KLRD's way of calling out some additional expenditures above what the agency had expected to spend when they initially submitted their 2024 budget in the fall of 22 and then had it approved by last legislative session, last year's. So most of these items shouldn't be too surprising. Item 3, the agency added additional expenditures from the Child Care and Development Fund. Again, all federal dollars is for child care quality and child care assistance. Item 4, the agency adds additional expenditures for utility assistance. This increase is due to the 2023 season for the low-income energy assistance program extending into 24 and some additional supplemental assistance for the water program. Item 5 is an add of $18 million This is in Spark money. These were community resource grants that the agency awarded. 7.8 million of that went to the Phillips Fundamental Learning Center in Wichita. 7.7 million went to Unite Us. 1.1 million of that 18 went to Community Greens Farms to implement a farm to school initiative. And then some pots of money went to Children's First to renovate and convert Woodland United Methodist Church in Wichita to become a community center. 375,000 went to Kansas CASA Association and 125 to CASA of Johnson and Wyandotte.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Is there a page reference, like page 17 for item 1? Is there a reference for item 5 somewhere in this document?
For item 5, there is not, but I have a handout I'm happy to provide if that would be helpful, if that's all right with the chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. So the handout you're receiving, thank you, Representative Clifford, just lists out what that 18 million is going towards.
Mr. Chairman, another point of order. Thank you for being ready for that.
I should have put it in the BA. My apologies that it wasn't in there.
One moment, please. We do have some more questions, I think. Representative Barth.
All right, thank you, Chairman Mason. So thank you for that point of order, because this is, you just handed out Spark is for number 5.
That will be for number 5, the community resource grants, correct.
And then do you have something similar for the 52 million on number 3?
I have,
Basically, if you have all of these, that would be great.
well, not entirely. It's all additional federal funding. For the Child Care and Development Fund, the agency does provide a nice report showing the transfers and expenditures from that fund. I don't go into detail. That's item number 3. And so I'm going to go ahead and that can be passed out. The front side of that document outlines how the agency spends their TANF funds. The back side shows the Child Care and Development Fund. Correct.
Go ahead and proceed, Amanda.
Sure. So number 4 is just utility assistance. That's additional funds that they've provided. Number 6 is additional 4E, Title 4E dollars. They are expending about 10.1 of those federal dollars towards some IT projects. Item 7 in the table is additional federal expenditures for their Prevention and Protection Services program. This is going to include Families First, Safe Families, Care Portal, and K-Park. And then the last line 8, just details some other adjustments in a variety of smaller programs. It includes Social Security, disability, rehabilitation services, and some SNAP funding. Items 9 and 10 are the governor's recommendation. So the governor concludes with the estimate for 2024, except for adding in the caseload process. Item 9 is the increase in foster care. That's primarily attributable to the agency's policy decision to amend the case management contracts to allow the case management organizations to cover actual costs in 24 with savings recognized from prior years. So after the fall consensus, those numbers have gone up. Item 10 is additional money for TANF. I'm sorry?
Representative Ballard.
I'm sorry, just a correction. You're on 8 on page 7. Then you said 9.
Correct.
Is that on?
So now I'm still on page 6 going down the table. I'm on the governor's recommendation. Looking at the table, item 9. Foster care caseloads, sorry. No, my fault, not yours. So again, 9 and 10 are both the governor's recommendation that includes the fall caseload process. So number 9, there's some additional SGF and federal funds needed. And again, there's what I mentioned before, where case management organizations are using funding from prior years, savings recognized from prior years to fund for 2024. The other thing that's going on is the need for that increased funding is actually offset because they're also receiving some additional federal foster care dollars. This is because there was a federal rule change that allows DCF to use kin-specific licensing standards for a child's foster home placement. So with that change, more family and kinship placements are going to become licensed and allow the state to pull down additional federal dollars and rely less on state general fund for care for that child. So those savings occur slightly in '24, but you're going to see more of those savings in the 2025 budget. So that's all in line 9 on the table. Line 10 is the change from TANF. The number of cases for TANF continues to decline. It was just slower than projected, and so there's some additional funding needed. That's it for '24.
Committee, what questions do you have for Amanda on fiscal year '24? I guess I'm not seeing any. Just to clarify, there items 3 through 8 on that analysis, no SGF used at all. It's all federal monies. And do you know how that just came to be, that those were suddenly available, or was it not suddenly available, or was it just?
A lot of it is just the agency revising their estimate. They have a better idea of how much federal dollars they're going to have and what those expenditures will be. Right.
Okay. Representative Ballard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 8, I have a question. When you say that expenditures for temporary assistance to needy families and caseloads are anticipated, they decrease. While the yearly decline in the caseloads, is there a specific reason why there is a decrease in the TANF caseloads?
So
Or is that something I should ask the agency?
You're welcome to. Caseloads are continuing to decrease with TANF. That's a part of years of different legislation limiting the lifetime benefits, increasing the work requirements. It is still decreasing, but the rate that it is decreasing is not as quickly, it's slower. And so because of that, in the fall, when the consensus estimate group got together, it was decided that a little bit more funds was needed.
I will follow up with the agent. Thank you for that. I understand that, but it seems that it's something we are doing that's causing that decrease. And I'll check on it because I'm wondering, that doesn't mean there isn't a demand for it, but it's what we have done. Because again, I go back to TANF, we used to have 60 months of that, and now we only have 24 months. And yet we still get that 3 years of revenue. You know, when we went to 2, they didn't cut 3. The federal government still continued to give us. So I will follow up on that because there's a correlation in my mind and also by looking at the caseloads. Okay? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Rees.
Is that also because the legislature has a tendency to use TANF funds for other things other than what it was intended?
That's not something I can speak to.
Okay.
And then dovetailing on that, so just my understanding is the 200,000 is just to supplement their original estimate because the caseloads are not going down as fast. So they thought they were going to be more, but we got to bounce it back up. Okay. Committee, other questions for fiscal year '24? I don't see any. If you want to proceed to 25.
Okay. We're going to jump ahead to a very similar table. It's the table on page 10. This is going to show 2025. Page 10 is the fiscal 2025 analysis. So about 2/3 down the table, you can see that the total agency request for fiscal year '25 is that $906.8 million, including $430 million SGF. This is an all funds decrease of $110 million from the agency's 2024 revised estimate. It's also an SGF decrease of $11.1 million. The request itself and this table is divided into two chunks. The first 13 items, so 1 through 13, are the enhancement requests from the agency. Items 14 through 18 show some major changes seen in the budget, including a significant decrease in expected expenditures from federal funds and from the end of reappropriations. And then the bottom chunk of the table shows the governor's recommendation. That would be items 19 through 24. And in that bottom chunk, you can see that I've lumped together the net dollar amount for the enhancements either not recommended or partially recommended, along with some additional changes in her recommendation, items 21, 22, 23, and 24. I'm going to speak through the enhancements very briefly. I know Secretary Howard was here the other day and covered a lot of those. And I will indicate which ones have been included in the GovRec. I speak from this table because it's easier for me, but if you want to follow along in real close detail, you can flip to page 14. That's going to have all the text of what I'm about to say. So if that's more your speed and you like that better, page 14 has that, but I'm just going straight down this table. So for the first item, the agency requested $21.4 million all funds to continue the development of the Comprehensive Child Welfare Information System. Secretary Howard described again that last month, informing the committee they had 11 bidders for the design, development, and implementation RFP, and are hoping to award that contract next March. Current projections for this project are less than previously reported, although the agency is still requesting 50% SGF funding. Previously, it was projected at 12.5 million SGF. Now the ask was 10.7 million SGF, and the governor ultimately partially recommended the enhancement, funding it at 8.5 million SGF. Next on the list is assistance for the vocational rehabilitation services. You might remember Secretary Howard described how two things are happening here. The agency is seeing an increase in the adult caseload for these services, but they've also received federal notice that they need to maintain spending 15% on youth services, that pre-ETS group. So this request would assist with that. The governor did recommend this. Next, the agency requested $350,000 all funds to continue the CAN Coach program with the Children's Alliance of Kansas. This is the professional development program that started at KU but has since been transitioning to Children's Alliance. The legislature did appropriate money for this in '24. The governor did not recommend this for '25. Item 4 in the list, the agency's ask is to fully maximize the state match for the Child Care and Development Fund for '25. Initially, the agency ask was a little high, and the governor's recommendation is just a more precise amount. So she is partially recommending that enhancement at 6.8 million all funds. The agency will be using this money to reduce the cost of child care for low-income families within their child care assistance program. Next, the agency is requesting, but the governor did not recommend, $1 million in expenditures, including just under $503,000 for the state's portion of the administrative expenses tied to providing SNAP benefits to eligible families during the summer months. This would be in the summer of fiscal year '25, and the governor did not recommend this. I would point out, though, earlier when I mentioned how the agency was going to spend their reappropriations dollars, the agency is using some of those reappropriated funds for this purpose in '24. Next, the agency requested, and the governor did recommend, 500,000 SGF to fund the expansion of Foster Adopt Connect into Wichita. Next, the agency requested 1.6 million all funds, just under 767,000 SGF to fund administrative costs for several of the agency's programs. You might recall Secretary Howard discussed how several costs are going up, including postage increases, the employment verification contract with Equifax, administrative hearing fees, software licensing fees. Previously, the agency covers these costs by reappropriations, holding positions open, or finding small savings in other programs. The governor did fund this enhancement using some of the state general fund savings I described earlier that are a result of licensing relative foster homes different than traditional foster homes. Next, the agency is requesting $2.5 million state general fund to establish 5 additional family resource centers. You might remember the map that has been shared showing that currently many of the sites serve several counties. These sites were initially started with one-time federal funding, which ends in September of '24. So the agency was seeking state general funding to continue supporting these 9 sites and supporting 5 new sites. Ultimately, the governor recommended $1.25 million state general fund to provide assistance to the current sites without an expansion. Next, the agency requested $300,000 for the Kansas CASA Association. This money would be used to ramp up their volunteer recruitment efforts, including hiring an outreach coordinator to recruit volunteers at the local CASA programs. The governor did not include this in her fiscal 2025 budget, but I would point out that that list of Spark Community Resource Capacity Grants that I gave out, $375,000 went to Kansas CASA and $125,000 went to Johnson and Wyandotte. Next, the agency is requesting funding for the Kansas Children's Cabinet to continue maintaining the Child Care Workforce Registry. This was initially developed using pandemic-era Child Care and Development Fund funds, but now the agency is looking to support the ongoing maintenance of the system. The agency initially requested state general fund for this, but the governor recommended using Children's Initiative Fund to continue that in 2025. Next, the agency requested, but the governor did not recommend, $700,000 and 2 FTE for the Kansas Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. Next, the agency and the governor both approved $1 million state general fund to increase the base funding for the 10 Centers for Independent Living in Kansas by $100,000 each. And lastly, the agency requested and the governor approved $1 million state general fund and assistance provided as post-adoption grants. This money, you might recall, Secretary Howard described, is to help families who have adopted a child and then may face additional struggles as a child goes through adolescence. So now, if you have flipped ahead, go ahead and flip back to page 10 to look at that table that I described. Everything that I just described is summed up in items 19 and 20, which is the sum total of enhancements not recommended and then enhancements partially recommended. Additionally, in this table, you can see that the governor, item 21 is a shift in funding, so that family preservation line. The agency had planned to use $3.2 million from the Children's Initiative Fund for the agency's preservation services. However, following the recommendations from the Kansas Early Childhood Transition Task Force, this expense has been shifted to State General Fund. Item 22 is a recommendation from the governor to add $15 million State General Fund as a one-time enhancement for child care sustainability grants and workforce support. Last month, I think Secretary Howard said over the course of the pandemic, over $283 million in federal funding was provided to child care providers to offset the cost during the pandemic. This $15 million SGF add that the governor recommends would continue those provider grants to approximately 3,500 providers. Lastly, items 23 and 24 are both, again, back to foster care caseloads. Item 23 reflects the consensus group estimate for foster care caseloads, including both a small SGF savings and a federal fund expenditure, primarily related to what I mentioned earlier about the change in licensing standards for kinship placement. Item 24 shows that subsequent to the consensus group meeting, the governor recommendation is anticipating additional $3.5 million in state general fund savings for that same reason that I described about changing the licensure requirements. Now, items 23 and 24, there needs to be a kind of a big asterisk with those. These are very loose estimates from the consensus estimating group. because when this was happening, DCF was still in negotiations for the new case management contracts that start in '25. So prior to the end of this session, these numbers are going to change and frankly, most likely increase, because as that process is finalized, we'll see a change there. I'm sorry?
Representative Ballard.
Numbers again, 20?
This is referencing items 23 and 24 in the table. I don't actually have a whole lot else to point out. The only other thing that's a little bit unusual for this group, I guess, but all the way in the back is the capital improvements, and they did have a request for $200,000 in '25 to replace the roof at the Topeka Center. That went before Joint Committee on State Building Construction, and they've given their approval for that. So that's on the back. Whew. Otherwise, that's all I wanted to cover. Happy to stand for questions.
Committee, questions on fiscal year '25 for Amanda? Representative Clifford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just on 13, the VR Center, my math's not adding up. Request $1 million for 10 centers by 1,000 each.
That's a typo. It should be 100,000 each. My apologies.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Ballard.
No. Thank you. That was what I was going to ask, but I made the change. I figured out where it was. Okay. Thank you.
And my understanding on that is that 1 million is in addition to their base budget. They already have it. All right. Committee, other questions? Seeing none. Thank you. Next, we'll hear from a familiar face, Secretary Howard. Welcome to committee again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Laura Howard, Secretary for DCF. Glad to be here with you today. You have a lengthy packet. I won't go through every page of this packet today, but I will try to highlight some things in the budget and maybe respond to some things that you've talked about during the course of this meeting so far. We start our document just by, kind of reminding you of our mission as an agency to protect children, strengthen families, and promote adult self-sufficiency. Just as a reminder, on page 4, DCF has 4 major program areas: prevention and protection, which is where all of the child welfare, foster care, prevention services fall; economic and employment services, which is our benefit programs, TANF, SNAP, LEAP, things like that; child support services; and then rehabilitation services, which is the vocational rehabilitation, the Centers for Independent Living that you were just speaking about. We carry out our work through teams in 36 service centers across 6 regional offices. So I won't go through the details of each of those programs. You have those on page, you just have a listing of the major programs on page 5, 6, 7, and 8 in terms of what we do in each of those programs. We did include a map on page 9 of our regions and our 36 service centers. The stars on the map show you where we actually have those local offices from which individuals are providing access to benefits, or from which investigators are going out to investigate abuse, or counselors are providing vocational rehabilitation services. There's several sets of charts in here, one for fiscal year '24 and one for fiscal year '25. So I won't go through all of these twice in both years because they're really the same charts, but I will point out a couple of things. Fiscal year '24, some of the funding, and I'm on page 10, it continues to be, we see the changes in fiscal year '24 from fiscal year '23 still a little bit skewed because some of the federal pandemic funds. So if you look at just that page 10, you can see DCF with a total budget in fiscal year '24 of $1,062 million. But if
if you look at the very bottom of that page, you can see kind of how the federal pandemic funds have been going down. So we had received $247.6 million that we spent in fiscal year 23, $100.5 million remained to be spent in fiscal year 24, and you'll see almost nothing as we get to fiscal year 25. So you'll start to get to a more normal looking budget. So when you've talked about, and you'll see this on some of the charts, like some of the child care dollars, we received a lot of funding related to child care during the pandemic that was spent out over a period of years. And I have a chart on the next page to show you that a little bit. But again, just generally in terms of our funding sources, and again, this is a little bit higher than usual. In fiscal year 24, about 56% of our budget is federal funds, 41% state general fund, and then a little bit from a few other state funds like the Children's Initiatives Fund. Again, that's a little bit higher because of the federal pandemic funds. You'll see that look a little bit reduced in terms of the federal share when we get to fiscal year 25. But page 11, shows you, and this is probably the last time we'll have this chart in our budget document, but it shows you the federal pandemic funding that DCF received starting in fiscal year 2020, and then how that spending has occurred over the years to come. And as you can see, by the time you get to 25, we only have about $1 million of that left. This funding came from, 4 different federal acts that passed Congress in 20 and 21. The vast majority of the funding that came to us as an agency, you'll see related to child care. Some of that came as enhancements to the Child Care Development Block Grant that is a normal part of our budget. Some of that came through special funding that Congress appropriated for child care crisis stabilization. So when you look at all of the funding that we received as an agency, you can see that like $460 million of that was related to child care. And again, the largest chunk of the spending of that over the course of the years has been that series of stabilization grants that went out and provided small grants to both home-based and center-based providers in order to try to retain those centers, at points in time where they may have been closed, they were trying to retain staff. And so again, most of that was several rounds of child care stabilization funds. There have been other child care projects. We have details on those, but again, just a context for that. And again, just wanted to sort of give you that context of the budget. You can see a lot of federal funds went through our budget, particularly in 2022 and 2023, related to a whole series of federally directed resources. For example, there was a special low-income water assistance program that was added that states needed to administer. We always, have a LEAP program that funds low-income energy assistance. A water program was added, and that was spending of $4.7 million to Kansas, where we worked with water companies to make sure that utilities stayed on and supported that. So again, there's a whole array of funding here. The main purpose of this is just to sort of show that our budget has been a little bit skewed for the last 2 or 3 years. You'll see that come into a more normal range as we go through fiscal year 24 and into fiscal year 25. I'm going to skip. Yes.
Secretary, can we pause just for a second?
Sure.
You have a question from Representative Hobson.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Thank you for your presentation. Was any of the amount from 22 to 23 like a carryover per se? I mean, I see there's for the child stabilization. I think was there.
Yes, I mean, in terms of the pandemic funds in particular, when we look at that page of the document, we receive large tranches of funding, more than we would spend in a year. So we needed to turn in plans to the federal government in terms of how we would spend that out over a period of time, and there were deadlines to spend those money, and that's why you see spending over multiple years in those categories. And again, each one was a little bit different in terms of what the requirements were, but again, lots of carryover money in terms of those federal dollars.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Please proceed.
Thank you. So I'm going to skip some of these next charts in fiscal year '24 because I'm going to talk about the same thing in '25, so it's not to repeat. So I'm going to move you over to page 17, and your staff already talked about this in terms of the actual budget changes in '24 in the governor's budget. You know, the governor included 1.7 million related to the pay plan shortfall that you see in all the agency budgets. The DCF share of that was 1.7 million. And then you'll see from the consensus caseload the changes related to TANF and foster care in fiscal year '24. So again, those were the only fiscal year '24 changes that we see here in terms of the governor's budget recommendations for us. As we move into fiscal year '25, when I showed you the pie chart earlier, when you go to page 18, you'll now see that in fiscal year '25, our federal state share is 51% federal funds, 46% state funds. That was higher earlier due to the pandemic funds, so that's kind of dropped back to a little bit of a more normal steady state. And again, then a few other funding sources from Children's Initiatives Fund and a couple of other smaller funding sources. But again, about 51% federal funds, 46% state general fund. And I'll show you that a little bit by our major program areas. On page 19, I just try to show some of our major program areas, and from all funding sources, you can see for our total budget of $941 million, about 430 of that is in the prevention and protection services area. That's the child welfare, foster care, prevention, family preservation, adoption is in that area. Economic and employment supports, the benefit programs is around 200 million. And you can look down the way. The next highest expenditure is actually our staffing in our regions, you know, the regional office service delivery, all of our investigators, our benefit workers, and the like. So again, you can see that, you know, by a large amount, prevention and protection services is the largest part of our budget. And when you look at the next two pages, I've just broken that down by, you know, what do we fund from state dollars primarily, and where do we tend to get more federal funds? So if you look at those same programs on page 20 by state general fund, you can see that in terms of our total state general fund budget, again, prevention and protection services is the highest percentage of that, 276 million out of 436 million. For example, economic and employment support, our benefit programs, that's only $33 million in state dollars, only $7.5 million in our vocational rehabilitation services, about 1.6 in child support, again, based on how the federal funding works. And then on the next page, you'll see where our federal funds go. Our highest category of federal funding goes into the child care program. Just over $100 million in 2005. Then you'll see about $94 million for TANF, about $90 million for foster care and adoption, and then smaller amounts show up for utility and SNAP. I might mention the SNAP is the food assistance, the actual food assistance expenditures are off-budget expenditures, so they don't show up in our budget. So what you see there for SNAP is just the administrative side of the costs. And I've got that number somewhere in terms of what the total spending is that you'll see later. But again, so really our child welfare, foster care, that arena, you know, high general fund spend, you see a higher federal fund contribution when you get into, you know, child care and TANF and the like, so. A couple of other just quick charts there before we get into actual budget changes. On page 22, again, in all funds expenditure by category, you can see that 2/3 of our budget is grants and assistance, 627.8 million out of 941 million. About 142 million in OOE. A lot of that includes the kinds of contracts we've talked about, like for Equifax, our child support contracts, our IT contracts. So again, large proportion of funding and grants and assistance. And then in terms of our salaries, 2/3 of our salaries are our regional office staff who are out there doing the direct service delivery. And we show you kind of how those positions break out on page 23, where you can see the largest tranche of positions are in our regions of our total positions. So in terms of the budget additions, we've talked about some of these, we've talked about these before, so I won't spend a lot of time on the enhancements on page 24. But again, enhancements of almost $48 million in the governor's budget, $31 million of that from state funds. The changes related to the consensus caseload that your staff talked about earlier, reflecting on the foster care side, some of the SGF savings related to relatives and kin, even though we have an all funds increase. So again, the enhancements and the consensus cases, and I'll talk about a couple of other items in a minute as well. So on the next page shows you the 25 enhancements that the governor supported. There were 10 enhancements, and then there were a few other funding shifts to talk about. So I'm just going to go through these very quickly. We talked about them already. The Comprehensive Child Welfare Information System. As your staff said, the governor's recommendation of $17 million, $8.5 million SGF was less than what we had in our submitted budget. But after we submitted our budget, and by the time that budget appeals came, we'd revise that estimate down based on what we were learning through the bidding process. So that's why that number in the governor's rec is a little bit less than what we had initially asked for. So it looks like a reduction in the governor's recommendation, but it really just reflects our revised estimate for what we would need for that program. And again, we hope to be able to award a contract next month and to talk with you more about that. Number 2 was the Foster Adopt Connect grants into Wichita. Again, we talked about that before, $500,000 SGF. Number 3 were the family resource centers. And as your staff indicated, what this enhancement would do would let us to continue to support 9 existing sites that we were able to fund with some one-time federal funding. So we're excited about that and about the outcomes that we can see from that project. Number 4 were the post-adoption services on page 31. Again, as your staff talked about earlier, really looking at the ability to impact those situations where after adoptions have taken place, sometimes many years later, there may be a risk of disruption of that adoption, and how we can support those families through a targeted program. So the governor's recommended $1 million to let us do that. The next one, number 5, is the sustaining child care program improvements and fully matching federal funds. So the governor's recommending $2.6 million state general fund dollars to let us pull down an additional $4.2 million in federal funds. It kind of changes all the time, the amount of the block grant that's available to states. And it kind of depends on activity going on in all the states, congressional appropriations. And this makes sure that we're pulling down all of those funds. So again, as you know, significant demands on child care and in the child care arena. This makes sure we're not leaving federal dollars on the table in terms of our child care program and our child care subsidy. Number 6, funds continuation of the Child Care Workforce Registry. This is one of the programs that we started with pandemic relief funds in partnership with the Children's Cabinet, Department of Health and Environment. This is really a project that helps to track the education progression of child care providers. And it really helps to support career ladders or ways to target benefits to individuals in different ways. This request will be the ongoing maintenance costs. The cost to develop the system took place with pandemic dollars. And what the governor has recommended is that that be funded from Children's Initiatives Fund. It's an early childhood program, and it's recommended that it come out of that funding source. And we would actually be transferring those dollars to the Children's Cabinet, and they would actually be the primary administrator for this. Number 7, funding child care sustainability payments. I talked about earlier that over the course of the pandemic, with the various tranches of federal dollars devoted to child care, we put out about $283 million over 3 years to child care providers to offset the costs of providing care during pandemic disruptions. They really provided a financial lifeline to many providers that were teetering on the brink of closure. I mean, our goal really was to, retain providers and not lose, that really, really critical sector that's so important to people being able to work. So some stability has been brought to the child care sector, but there's some fear that kind of the cliff created by the federal funds still leaves some providers on the brink without some additional financial support. So the governor's recommending one more round of sustainability grants of $15 million with a focus on the home-based providers who may not be eligible for some of the other kinds of accelerated grants and things that are occurring through the Children's Cabinet for the development of new resources. So again, really, really trying to ensure that those home-based providers stay in business. Then just a couple more. Number 8, the vocational rehabilitation caseload. As your staff said, there were 2 parts to this. These are, again, the funds for individuals with disabilities who are seeking to retrain and enter the workforce. And we obviously need workers in the state in a lot of different avenues. And so this will fund the increases in that caseload and will also fund services to youth through what's called the PREATS, the Pre-Employment Transition Program. Those are youth with disabilities, and we have to spend 15% of our total dollars on expenditures on youth as they're looking to transition to adulthood. And so again, that's what this funding would do. Number 9, the Centers for Independent Living. Again, would provide $1 million to increase core funding for the Centers for Independent Living. I think, you provided some funding last year, and this really builds on that to really build on the core funding that each of those centers would receive. Number 10 were some administrative operating expenses that the governor funded in our budget. This enhancement was offset by some SGF savings related to the relative foster homes that I'll talk about in a minute. But again, the largest item here had to do with that Equifax contract. I think you've heard about that from both us and KDHE a couple times. And there are some other areas as well. So those were really the 10 enhancements. And then there were a handful of other changes the governor's recommending. Page 38, the governor's recommending a financing change. The governor's recommending that family preservation be funded through state general fund dollars. Right now, it's funded through a mix of state general fund dollars and Children's Initiatives Fund. A few years ago, during one of the kind of budget shortage times, family preservation was an area where the state general fund budget was cut a little bit, and CIF was put in to replace the general fund to keep it flat. The governor's recommending that CIF money stay with the Children's Cabinet to fund early childhood services, and that family preservation receives state general fund dollars. So not an increase in the program. This is a recommendation for a funding shift to target CIF dollars to early childhood. And then the other changes on page 39, the other budget change was we gave back $3.5 million in administrative savings related to that licensing change for relatives and kin. Again, there was also savings on the caseload side, but these are the administrative savings. So that was a $3.5 million reduction there. So, and again, some of this wasn't in our original budget because the rule wasn't final yet. So those are some of the major issues. We, of course, we know you'll consider the pay plan separately, but certainly would advocate both for the 5% increase as well as the increase to $15 per hour per employees making less than that. You know, we have some human service assistant positions in our field offices that really kind of help with the paperwork and let our benefit specialists really serve clients. And we have about 100 that are currently paid under $15. Incredible difficulty in recruiting and filling those, and yet they play such a critical role in kind of keeping that process going. I might mention one other item that you won't see here. I know that I was talking with Budget Director Profit earlier today. He indicated that he talked to both the chair of the Ways and Means Committee and the chair of Appropriations, and tomorrow there will be a budget amendment that comes out. One of the items that comes out in that budget amendment will be a DCF item, and it will be an increase of $1.4 million state general fund for a family finding system. Some of you may recall that this was actually something that you funded in the budget last year, and that the governor vetoed. It's really it's a technology product that would allow our staff and our case management providers additional tools as they're working with finding families and relatives of youth. And so again, I don't know what else is in the GBA, but that's one item that will be in the GBA. So I thought I'd mention that today. You'll see that formally, I think, tomorrow. So the next few pages, kind of page 41 and 42, and then starting on page 43, we've got information on kind of performance-based budget. You can see some of our performance indicators, and then you can see kind of our caseload summary over time for the various programs and some charts connected to that. I'm happy to answer any questions about those. I don't feel the need, unless you want me to go over each of those pages. But I did want to spend a few minutes just giving you some updates on some things you recommended last year, either in the budget or in legislation. Starting on page 49, you graciously, the legislature funded $6 million for the development of further therapeutic family foster homes. And as you know, we had started that as a category of service within our foster care program, but you gave us some funding for capacity building. About half of that is going out for capacity building grants, and we're just about finished with those awards. About 25% of that to make sure we have the right training and course development to really support those families, and then a portion of that related to some centralized recruitment. The second item, in terms of an update on page 50, has to do with juvenile crisis intervention centers. There was some legislation that passed last year that kind of expanded some of the scope of treatment services there. But you actually passed this act a number of years ago. I'm pleased to report that we finally took rules and regulations to the JCAR committee last Friday. We have the public hearing in a few weeks. We've executed a memorandum of agreement with the Department of Corrections Juvenile Services because this program was always supposed to be funded with $2 million from the Evidence-Based Program Fund. And so we will soon be ready to enter into provider agreements with willing providers who wish to establish juvenile crisis intervention centers. The $2 million will help with some startup, and then there'll be the ability to bill Medicaid for youth as well. We know right now that Johnson and Sedgwick counties have interest in that kind of facility. Page 51, you appropriated $1 million for us last year related to prevention services for foster children with an intellectual or developmental disability. We did a lot of work with stakeholders and partners and ended up entering into a grant with Families Together, which is a really well-known advocacy organization in the IDD world, family support organization. And so they are out there now providing support to families, parenting workshops, helping families connect with resources and client assistance funds. So again, we're looking forward to measuring that and being able to give you some data about that in the future. A couple more quick ones. Functional family therapy, I think it was this budget committee that also initially put in $2 million that stayed in the budget to support functional family therapy grants for children in DCF custody. And so the goal really was to be able to work with agencies who already do that work for Department of Corrections. So we've entered into awards with Ember Hope, Cornerstones of Care, and Eckerd Connects to provide those services, and they're staffing up and beginning to provide those services. And as you know, when you talked about that last year, it's a really, really effective modality, particularly when you think about older youth and some pieces like that. Kind of a related item on page 53. The legislature last year passed House Bill 2021. It was mainly about Department of Corrections juvenile services, but it did have some elements in it related to our foster care case management agencies and community juvenile service agencies. Essentially, it allows for DCF youth who exhibit certain kinds of offending behaviors through some assessments and scales to access some of those community-based juvenile offender services through the local juvenile service agencies. So we moved quickly on that. We identified the assessment that needed to be used under the bill, and our providers have that information and are working with the JCABs when it makes sense to refer a child for those services. Let's see. Yeah, we have a few other updates on the next pages just about some of our work on the performance-based contracts. I think we have a regular report we have to provide to the legislature each year. We've just summarized that on page 54 and 55. And on page 56, kind of just a series of other funding that you provided for us last year in the child welfare arena, and just making sure that you know that we have invested that funding as intended, raising the rates for relative and non-kin placement rates to 70% of the family foster care rate, expanding We Can Drive statewide, expanding Healthy Families to 4 new counties, increasing the independent living subsidy for youth who age out of custody to $1,100 per month, adding safe family services in 4 more counties, and then you provided some funding for the CAN Coach program as well in that transition. I think that the rest, just a couple of updates in the economic and employment support areas. Just a reminder, subsequent to the Kansas legislature making some decisions related to work requirements for able-bodied adults and increasing those from age 18 to 59, the federal government as well in the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023 is also phasing in some higher requirements. Our requirements are still more stringent, but again, this would require able-bodied adults to be limited to 3 months of SNAP in a 3-year period unless they work 80 hours per month, participate in certain work programs. And again, our age limit actually goes up to 59. The new federal requirements would gradually phase that up to age 54. And then I'll skip a couple of pages here and just page 59, just for your information as well. Some of the other adjustments that you made in economic and employment services last year, the additional match for childcare, that the funding associated with increasing that mandatory age, some new TANF for the Boys and Girls Clubs, as well as some of the rate increases that you did last year in rehab services. So, I'll stop there, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to talk about anything I didn't speak to, but I think that was a lot of information. So.
Very well, Madam Secretary. I think we'll have some questions. We'll start with Representative Carpenter.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Thanks for being here. A couple of things I wanted to touch on. It's on page 24 here, food assistance. We're talking about vision and SNAP. It's not SNAP, but it's food assistance. So on page 29 here, 57, on slide 57, it talks about gradually increasing the limits, limited 3 months of SNAP, 3-year period, they work 80 hours or more. But yet in this narrative here, the total food assistance for 2022 totals $651 million. That's more than twice the amount of 2020 of $290 million. So if we've ratcheted up the restrictions on EBT benefits, vision, whatever you want to call it, how did we get another double that?
So
And who's using it?
if I'm looking at what you're looking at in terms of,
On page 24, right here, food assistance.
Yep.
On the budget. Kind of down at the bottom on the right-hand side, under food assistance.
are you on the budget analysis or on my slides? Yeah, maybe on budget analysis, yeah, sorry about that. I was looking for, in our slides, just going to ask my team if we, 43. If you look at page 43, I think this might help to explain that a little bit. If you look, 43 on the slides, yeah. Because when you talk about the $650 million, during the pandemic, there were increases to the food assistance benefit levels that were mandated by our federal partners. So people were getting higher amounts of food assistance. So if you look at halfway down on the slide 43, SNAP food assistance, you'll see in 2022, at one point, 198,000 people, $651 million. Then you begin to see those dollars go down and the number of people go down gradually. So that went down to the $682 million in 23, still showed the enhanced federal benefits that we were paying under SNAP, during the pandemic. So you take that away and you see those dollars go all the way down to $384 million. But I think more relevant, if you look at the numbers of people, the 93,200 to 91,500, you begin to see the impact of some of those work restrictions. And they're gradual, because really what we want is for people to be doing what they need to be doing and being able to retain those benefits because they're doing the work requirements. So. So again, the $600 million is really skewed because that really had to do with the enhanced benefits that the federal government, food assistance is always where additional money is put in whenever there's an economic downturn because it kind of goes directly, it's spent right away, it goes directly to, retailers, stores, et cetera. So you see that really in any economic downturn, that tends to be one of the federal strategies. But again, you'll see that number get back down to, an estimate of $345 million in 25. And again, we estimate almost a couple thousand fewer people receiving those benefits in 25 than this year.
Very good. Thank you for that. One more question.
Yes.
Please, Mr. Chairman. So the child care sustainability or workforce sustainability workforce grants for $15 million.
Yes.
So it's on page 26. The narrative is fairly slim on what that does here. It's on the left-hand side on 26.
So what the child care sustainability grants do is they will provide grants to child care providers across the state, probably around $4,000 for a provider when you think about like a home-based provider, a little bit higher when you look at center-based providers. And as I said earlier, we did this already during the pandemic. We had 3 rounds of sustainability grants, almost $280 million in child care that went towards those provider sustainability grants. Those benefited about 3,900 providers in the various rounds, and all 105 counties participated in at least a couple of those rounds Again, there were certain requirements about it, but what we tended to see was that providers initially used those funds to cover salaries for workers, to cover enrollment fees that might have normally been paid by families. That was during the heart of the pandemic, right? When, maybe the center couldn't even be open or families weren't working, those sorts of things. But again, really allowing them to kind of keep the facilities open, ensure the slots stayed there for existing families so that they could keep their staff on board. And so what the governor is recommending is kind of one more round of those grants. I mean, it's still a very, very fragile sector of our economy. We really can't afford to lose, particularly some of those home-based providers. We really can't afford to lose those providers with the needs we have for childcare. So as part of all of her childcare package, which is I think about $56 million, she's recommended $15 million in child care grants. You'll see some other funding in the Children's Cabinet that builds on some funding, some of the work they did with Spark that's actually about developing new slots. This is really about trying to retain, some of those fragile, primarily home-based providers, really through some small grants to support them.
So it's $4,000. You think that would keep a daycare open or a childcare facility open?
It's been amazing what we heard back from those providers about what a difference those small amounts of money made to them. So we believe so. I mean, we had really good reports, during the pandemic, and and as we continue to look at the programs that are out there, we've seen them fluctuate, go up and down some, but we certainly saw some stabilization during the time we were doing the sustainability grants, and we just want to have a chance to sustain that.
I understand that. So this is kind of what happens when we do one-time money, and then the next thing you know, we'd all talked about all of the ARPA money and all that was going to be one-time money, and here it is now being replaced with SGF.
That's correct. And again, the governor's recommending this for 1 year. And I understand your point, Representative, but the governor's recommending that for 1 year for that $15 million. Of course, that's, in the context as recommending kind of just a new way to look at child care in the state in terms of the work coming out of the Child Care Task Force, which, is a different policy discussion. So, thank you.
Dovetailing on that, the money would be dispersed how? It would just automatically, or are these home care providers going to have to do an application? How is that going to work?
There'd be it worked very well during the pandemic. We had a very brief application process. We used our partners at Child Care Aware to do that. And so I think we would probably use the very same process. It was administratively very simple. So I think we would probably use the same process.
So the partner you would use would make sure that they were in fact in the child care business and not just receiving a check?
Yes, absolutely. And we worked really closely with Health and Environment because, for example, if there were any issues with their licensure or if they were under like a corrective action plan, or there were a few criteria where you couldn't be eligible to receive the grant if certain things were happening with your facility. So,
thank you. Committee, other questions? Representative Ruiz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Madam Secretary. Looking at slide number 57, your slides, the SNAP policies.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Do you know what the average award is for SNAP?
I'm gonna turn to my staff because they can probably look it up faster than I can. I actually think it's in here, so we can get that for you. I don't see it right here. We can get that for you by tomorrow, Representative.
Okay, and according to what I'm reading, if a person is working, okay, so they're limited to a 3-year period unless they work 80 hours a month, so roughly around 20 hours a week, participate in work programs or at least 80 hours a month or a combination. then they're eligible for that 3-year period, or is that renewed if they're working those 80 hours or a combination thereof?
Yes, so yeah, that's always a great question with what we call the ABODS population. So, I mean, the general rule is they can receive benefits no more than 3 months of a 36-month period if they're not doing those work pieces. Now, that resets every 3 years. So say a person wasn't doing anything, maybe they got benefits for 3 months, then they didn't get benefits for, 2 years and 9 months. They would have a chance again for up to 3 months. So it's very, very limited for able-bodied adults.
Thank you.
Representative Ballard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A question I had asked earlier about your TANF caseloads and that they're decreasing.
Yes.
I think with that, since it's cash assistance in many ways, there was childcare associated with it. Previously, after 20 hours, after being on for 2 years, you have to be working 20 hours or in a training program or a degree program. So we reduced it, as I said before, from 5 years to 2.
Correct.
But yet we still received the money for those 3 years, and we have used them for a variety of programs under whatever the 4 guidelines to keep us legitimate.
Correct.
So why is it decreasing, other than people who came off of the rolls, and we assured that they would try to, notify them again, but it's a transit population. So can you just tell me why is it decreasing when I don't think all those people that were in need left the state of Kansas?
I mean, Representative, you've articulated it correctly. I mean, the eligibility changes that were made in Kansas law a few years ago made it far more restrictive to be able to access TANF, including, as you said, the reduction of, federally, there's a 5-year time limit. In Kansas, there's a 24-month time limit. So if you look at slide 47, you can kind of see the impact of those changes. As you look at just the picture of the caseload going down, you always see ups and downs of TANF, during, obviously, economic downturns where people come and need assistance. The economy going great, you see fewer. But when you begin to see the really, abrupt changes in, fiscal year 14, 15, 16, where we go from, what we intended to have in TANF, really kind of over the course of everything I can remember, over 30 or 40 years, you'd have, somewhere between 35 and 45,000 people on TANF, depending upon the economy. Now, the numbers have gone down to, we estimate in fiscal year 25, 6,700. But again, the impact of those time limits, the impact of just the eligibility changes that made a lot of people not eligible for the program. So both the time limits and the other eligibility pieces. Now, we did see, during the pandemic, a slight increase. In fiscal year 20, we actually had the caseload go up a little bit. 7.7%. And then as the pandemic eased, we began to see it go down again. But as you will note in the caseloads, the last couple years, it's not gone down nearly as much as it has for a number of years, only about 1%. But I think that's that press of some of the economic things that we were facing against what those policies are. So again, you're right. The state continues to get the TANF block grant of $101 million each year. As you can see, in terms of our cash spending, that's about, $9 million, about 10% of that $100 million, or 9% of that. So you'll see the remainder. Some of that is transferred to social service block grant. Some of that's used for a number of the grants you're aware of, Boys and Girls Club, a number of grants. If we provide you that table before of all of the grant-funded programs that meet the 4 criteria. Certainly a chunk is spent on employment and training. which is important. But we do spend very little on cash, and it's tied directly to the eligibility criteria in Kansas.
One went up slightly. Could that have been because of COVID and everything else? We put more, we allowed a little leeway as to who could actually go on. And now, we're in the process of taking them off again. Would that have contributed to that increase?
I think more the economic impact of COVID. We didn't have so much the same things happen in TANF as like you see in Medicaid or food assistance, where there are particular federal policies that changed. We just saw more people seek to access TANF, maybe some who had never accessed it before, that maybe were individuals who lost employment during the COVID time period. So we did see, again, that little bump in 2020. And we had about almost an 8% increase, and that was really unusual. We had not seen an increase like that for a long time, so.
So has TANF still, the basis of that was employability? In many ways, when we talked about TANF, it was to prepare for employability because you only had the 5 years to be on it. Mm-hmm. So has that definition changed from employability? Because if we're no longer have the 4 years that maybe you could go to college, 2 years you could train, childcare that would assist you in doing that. So is that definition a little loose now?
So, federally, right? The program since it started was temporary assistance for needy families. You could spend the money in kind of 4 main categories. Obviously, a huge focus on employment pieces. One of the things that's going on right now federally there are some proposed new federal regulations that we don't have the final regulations yet, so it's kind of really hard to know yet the impact in terms of things we've chosen to fund in Kansas or the other states have chosen to fund. But the new federal regulations are focused, appear to be focused much more on the issue that you're talking about, Representative, in terms of employment and work. When we'll have to see when those regulations come out, how they might impact programs that we currently fund. We fund JAG through TANF. We fund a lot of different programs through TANF. So again, those regulations have been out. I think that we're taking comments up to about the holiday period. So I would expect later this spring we will see what those new regulations look like. And the focus certainly does seem to be states having more focus on employment and training. And we have a very active employment and training program. We have career navigators in our regional offices. I get reports every month of the jobs that people are going to, either from TANF or SNAP, what those wage rates are and those things. So we have an active employment program. But again, we also spend a lot of resources on a number of other facets that relate to families. We spend a fair amount of TANF in foster care too. So again, we'll obviously keep the legislature updated as those regulations come down. It was kind of premature for this budget. We kind of don't want to say the sky is falling if it isn't, but certainly there seems to be an effort to really tighten up on how states are using those dollars. You may have read things nationally, right, about what in Louisiana about volleyball stadiums being built, or there were some crazy things that happened nationally that I think got to some huge focus on how states were using that block grant.
My last question, on your enhancement on 16, but basically what you're talking about, the adoption services, and then the 1 million additional money to fund grants for families with adopted children who are at risk of removal. And I think you alluded to that in your explanation, that maybe people are having trouble with their adoption. And would you explain that? I wasn't sure what that meant.
Sure. No, that's a great question, Representative. What we have found is, and what we've seen is, you'll have families who've adopted a child, and it may be many years later, maybe when that child's reaching adolescence, that there end up being some, really difficult behaviors, and maybe many years later that adoption's at risk of disruption, or that child's at risk of coming back into the child welfare system. So, and we've seen, I think we put the numbers in here in terms of that we've seen an average of 93 removals of kids after the adoption since 2015, and almost 3/4 of those have been 6 years or later after the adoption. So this isn't right after, and again, oftentimes in adolescence. And so these would be some targeted services to those families to help address those problems that could result in the removal of the child, and really some targeted grants to support those families who have adopted kids from our system, but who then a few years later might be facing some particular challenges that in many cases may go back to things that happened when the child was very young. You know, the impact of trauma can last a long time, and sometimes things really kind of show up in adolescence, so.
I had no idea.
Representative Rees.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know, sorry about that. Here we go again. I was looking at Will, no. A couple of questions. One question goes back to the governor's recommendations in the budget. Regarding the summer EBT program,
Yes.
can you help me understand, it's number, I don't know if you have the same page, it's on page 15, number 6. It's an enhancement. I know the governor did not recommend the adoption of this request, but can you help me understand that a little bit better?
Sure, sure. In our initial budget request, we had asked for some funding to support the new permanent summer EBT program. This is another, this is an area where the federal government has passed a new summer food program. And we had asked for some funding for some staffing in our field offices. And I think the governor, I mean, just in not recommending that, we'll just absorb that within our overall salaries, in the sense that, you know, we have field staff who touch a lot of different programs. We have a lot of field staff. And so our intention is still to move forward fully with the program. We just didn't get, you know, targeted increases in staffing that we had recommended. I'm not concerned about that, Representative.
Okay. So it's not, the program itself is not in jeopardy, it's more like you said here, in the administrative
Yeah,
aspects of it.
correct,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. And then I had a second question, I'm trying to remember. Oh, you said how much of the block grant we received from the federal government for TANF. Can you repeat that? I didn't get it.
101.7 million, I think, is the amount we get every year.
Thank you.
When you see it on the chart, that's 101.5 million, actually, I think I was wrong. But when you see it on the chart here, it shows up as 94 million. That's because some of it is transferred over to another block grant. And so, but the total is 101.5 million. And that's been the same since welfare reform passed in a number of years ago. It really hasn't changed.
Committee, other questions? I have a few quick ones, if you don't mind, Madam Secretary.
Sure.
To dovetail off Representative Rees, the summer EBT program, there is money in the budget for this currently. This was to augment that, right? And that's what the governor did not allow.
The governor did not, the governor did not recommend new administrative funding to manage the program. We would use our existing staff. I think, as your staff talked earlier, there's a little bit of some reappropriations that we were using for some one-time costs. We need to make some IT system changes, things like that. And then, of course, all of the service costs are paid federally. That's 100% federal. So,
The program itself, is there a means test, or are there certain eligibility requirement?
there is. So with the summer EBT program, I mean, you're really talking about kids eligible for free and reduced lunch. So there's kind of a matching if they're already on SNAP, if they're already on free and reduced lunch. And so we're able to do matching with the Department of Education. And then there may be some families that still need to apply because maybe they weren't in that program, but perhaps they now feel that they qualify. So there'll be some matching, some data matching for some families, and then an application process for others. And again, we've done this program a couple times now because it was a pandemic academically funded summer program. It's changed a little bit each year. This would now make it a permanent program for states to administer. So we already have some experience with how to manage that.
My final question, the FTEs have been kind of dropping post-COVID because the federal funding is dropping as well, but out of the projected 2590.8 that ends up in the governor budget, do you still have vacancies there? Are there still unfilled positions? And if so, could you characterize the number?
So I actually have that if I just need to get to the page. So if we look at, I'll actually use the 2024 number since we're not to 2025 yet. I think there were 2,665 budgeted. We have 2,118 filled positions and 538 vacancies are our numbers right now. And the shrinkage in our budget is 10.3% in the current year and would be 12.1% in 25.
And those 500 vacancies would be system-wide, statewide, or are they?
Yes, I mean, they are. I mean, they're primarily, we could provide some details on those, but there would be a lot of those within our service delivery, but they're spread throughout. We've got challenges in IT, challenges in finding attorneys, but also just challenges in finding like folks to do benefits work and the like. Things have been getting better. I mean, I would say that we have felt very good about our recruitment efforts in the last few months, particularly since some of the pay plan efforts. I mean, we're getting, in some of our regions, we're getting applications for positions where we really were hardly getting any. So, I think it's definitely improving. But yeah, I wouldn't, but yeah, we always would have a certain number of vacancies, but obviously this is a little bit high, so.
Committee, last call for questions. Representative Rees.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Got it right this time. With that summer EBT program, do you have any idea how many children this affects?
I don't right now, Representative, but I'll see if we have that information. Yeah, we should be able to get you something on that.
Thank you.
Okay, committee, thank you,
Thank you.
Madam Secretary.
Thank you.
I think we've grilled you long enough. Tomorrow we'll have public input on, we'll have a continuation on this. We'll have public input. Nothing else. We are adjourned. Thank you.